The Queen's brutal rule. The training arena was silent, except for the sound of labored breathing. The warriors stood in a wide circle, their bodies covered in sweat, dirt, and bruises. The floor beneath them was stained with blood, some fresh, some old. Overhead, the metal ceiling buzzed with dim red lights, casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. At the center of it all, the savage queen sat on her cold, high throne, watching with sharp, unblinking eyes. Her armor gleamed under the lights, a symbol of power and merciless rule. Her face, half covered by a jagged metal mask, showed no emotion. She had no interest in weakness. Strength was all that mattered. Again, she commanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The warriors, barely able to stand, clenched their fists. Their muscles screamed for rest, their lungs burned from exhaustion, but no one dared to disobey. In this brutal empire, only the strong survived. A trial of strength. Among the warriors stood Kellen, a young fighter with sharp eyes and an iron will. He had seen many fall to the Queen's ruthless training. Some had died, others had been discarded like broken weapons. But Kellen refused to be one of them. As the Queen's elite guard stepped forward, carrying wooden staffs, the warriors knew what was coming. The test of endurance, a cruel challenge where each fighter had to take 10 strikes without falling. If they fell, they were weak. If they cried out, they were useless. One by one, the warriors stepped forward, their bodies trembling. The guards swung the staffs with brutal force, striking legs, arms, backs. Cries of pain echoed through the arena, but the Queen remained unmoved. Pain was a lesson. Survival was the reward. When Kellen's turn came, he clenched his jaw. The first strike hit his ribs, a sharp burst of pain exploding through his chest. He staggered but remained standing. The second strike hit his back, then the third, the fourth, each blow harder than the last. His vision blurred, his breath came in short gasps, but he didn't fall. The Queen's eyes narrowed as she watched him. Unlike the others, Kellen did not just endure, he resisted. Defiance in his eyes. By the time the 10th strike landed, Kellen's knees threatened to buckle. His body screamed for relief, but he refused to break. The Queen rose from her throne, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. The room fell into complete silence. No one spoke when the Queen moved. No one dared. She stopped in front of Kellen, looking at him with cold amusement. "You refuse to fall," she said, tilting her head. Her voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge beneath it. "Why?" Kellen lifted his chin, meeting her gaze. He knew the risk of speaking. He had seen warriors executed for less, but something inside him refused to stay silent. "Falling means weakness," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "But obeying without thinking is also weakness." The air in the arena grew heavy. A murmur rippled through the warriors. No one had ever spoken like this before, not in front of the Queen. The guards tensed, waiting for her command. The Queen's fingers twitched near the hilt of her sword. For a long moment, she simply stared at Kellen. Then, to everyone's shock, she laughed. A cold, sharp laugh that sent shivers down the warriors' spines. "You think yourself clever," she said. "Let's see how clever you are when your body is broken." She turned away, her cloak sweeping the ground. "Prepare the next trial," she ordered. "Let's see how long this defiance lasts." The arena of blood. Moments later, the warriors were herded into a new arena. This one was different. No weapons, no rules. Only survival. The Queen stood above them, looking down like a god passing judgment. "The weak will fall," she declared. "The strong will remain." A loud gong echoed, and suddenly, the battle began. Warriors lunged at each other, fists flying, bodies colliding. Some fought desperately, while others struck with cold precision. Kellen dodged a wild swing from a brute twice his size, rolling across the dirt. Nearby, a younger fighter, barely 18, was struggling against an opponent far stronger. Kellen saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation. He won't last long. Kellen had a choice: fight alone and survive, or help someone and risk everything. The queen watched from above, her lips curling into a cruel smile. Would Kellen betray his own instincts just to help another, or would he prove himself ruthless? A choice that changed everything. As the young warrior was about to be struck down, Kellen made his choice. He lunged forward, grabbing the attacker's arm and twisting it. With a sharp cry, the brute fell to the ground, unconscious. The young warrior looked at Kellen in shock, breathing heavily. "You saved me," he gasped. Kellen simply nodded and turned back to the fight. More opponents were coming. He had no time for words. The queen's smirk faded slightly as she observed. No one had ever done this before. Her warriors had always been trained to be selfish, brutal, merciless. But Kellen was something else, something dangerous. And for the first time in years, the queen felt something unexpected: doubt. A warrior unlike any other. The battle raged on, but Kellen fought differently. He outsmarted his opponents, dodging blows, using their own strength against them. He didn't kill, but he never lost. When the dust finally settled, Kellen still stood, bruised, bleeding, but undefeated. The queen leaned forward, resting her chin on her fist. "Interesting," she murmured. The trial was over, but for Kellen, the real challenge was only beginning. Because now, he had her attention, and in the savage queen's empire, that could either mean glory or death. The impossible challenge. The blood-red moons of Sci-Fi hung high in the sky as the warriors were dragged back into the execution arena, a place where the queen's enemies took their last breath. Tonight, however, it was not traitors or spies who stood in the pit. It was her own warriors. Kellen wiped the blood from his lips, his body aching from the previous trial. He had survived when he should have fallen. Now, the queen wanted to break him her way. Above, she stood on her black steel balcony, her piercing eyes locked onto Kellen. A slow, calculating smirk curved her lips. "You refuse to kill," she said, her voice carrying across the arena. "Let's see if you can survive without doing so." Kellen clenched his fists. He knew what this meant. No weapons, no rules. 15 warriors, only 5 can leave alive. A loud gong shattered the silence. The challenge had begun. Betrayal in the blood. Kellen barely had time to react before someone grabbed him from behind, locking him in a crushing chokehold. He recognized the grip. It was Derek, a fighter who had once trained beside him. Someone he trusted. "There's no way out," Derek whispered. "I won't die here." Kellen threw his elbow back, slamming it into Derek's ribs. The grip loosened, and Kellen rolled free, just as another warrior lunged at him with a sharpened rock. The chaos had begun. All around, warriors turned on each other, brothers becoming enemies, friends becoming killers. Blood sprayed across the dirt as bodies collapsed. The queen watched, satisfied. This was how warriors were truly forged, not in training halls, but in the fires of desperation. Kellen dodged, ducked, countered. He refused to kill, but he wouldn't let himself be killed either. He used his attacker's own strength against them, striking nerves, disarming them, leaving them unconscious. But the numbers were too high. He was only one against many. A brutal kick struck his side, sending him crashing to the ground. His vision blurred as he gasped for air. A shadow loomed over him. Varric, the strongest warrior in the arena. Varric raised his fists for the final blow. But before he could strike, the beast unleashed. A deep roar shook the arena. The ground trembled. The warriors froze. Something huge slammed into the metal gates of the arena. The queen's smirk faded. She turned to one of her generals. "You opened the wrong cage," she said coldly. The gate burst open, and out of the shadows came the Typhorian nightmare, a monstrous creature with razor-sharp fangs 6 legs, and eyes that burned like molten lava. A creature bred to kill. The warriors, who had been fighting each other, now had a bigger enemy. The nightmare lunged, tearing through the nearest fighter like paper. Panic spread as warriors ran for their lives. Kellen, still on the ground, watched in horror. The queen had turned a deathmatch into a massacre. But then something clicked in his mind. She didn't just want them to kill. She wanted them to die trying. A different kind of strength. As warriors screamed and scattered, Kellen did the opposite. He stood his ground. The nightmare locked its fiery eyes on him. Sensing his defiance, it roared and charged. Kellen had no weapons, no armor. Only his mind. At the last second, he sidestepped, making the beast slam headfirst into the steel wall. Dust and debris exploded everywhere. The creature shook itself and turned back toward him. The queen leaned forward, for the first time intrigued. Kellen wasn't running. He was thinking. Instead of fighting the beast head-on, he observed it, the way it moved, the way it reacted to noise, its blind spots. The warriors who attacked it with brute force were cut down instantly. But Kellen, he outmaneuvered it. When it lunged, he made it strike the ground instead. When it charged, he made it crash into another warrior. Step by step, the beast grew frustrated. The queen's amusement turned into something else, curiosity. No one had ever fought a nightmare like this. Kellen wasn't the strongest warrior, but he was the smartest. The queen's hand clenched. The battle lasted longer than anyone expected. By the time it ended, the nightmare lay panting on the ground, exhausted and unable to move. And standing above it, breathing hard, bloody but alive, was Kellen. The queen's fingers curled against the steel railing of her throne. He had done it again. Survived when he should have fallen. Her warriors looked at Kellen differently now. Not just as an equal, but as someone worth following. She could feel it. The air had shifted. And for the first time, a dangerous thought crept into her mind. If Kellen was not broken, he might be the one to break her. The queen's deadliest trial. The air in the Colosseum of Shadows was thick with tension. The scent of blood, sweat, and burning torches filled the vast underground chamber. Warriors stood along the stone pathways, whispering among themselves. Some still bore bruises from the last trial. Others bore new fears. But all eyes were on Kellen. He had done the impossible. He had defied the queen and still stood alive. He had fought the nightmare, not with brute strength, but with strategy, and survived when others had fallen. And now the queen would punish him for it. From her obsidian throne, the queen watched Kellen with a gaze colder than space itself. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. Her lips curled in a smirk that held both amusement and thinly veiled rage. "You think yourself clever, warrior," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. "You refuse to break. You refuse to kneel." Kellen didn't respond. He only stared back, unblinking. The queen's smirk widened. "Good. Then let's see if you can survive my most dangerous trial," she continued, rising from her throne. The black pit. A deep boom echoed through the chamber as the floor beneath Kellen began to split open. The descent into darkness. Chains rattled as 2 towering guards stepped forward, gripping Kellen's arms before he could react. They pulled him toward the growing gap in the stone floor. Beneath him, pure darkness yawned open, stretching far below the arena. A pit with no end, a place where no light had ever touched. Even the warriors, trained in suffering and war, shifted uncomfortably. The black pit was worse than death. No one had ever returned. Kellen clenched his fists as he felt the heat rising from below. It wasn't fire. It was something far worse. The queen took slow, deliberate steps toward the edge, looking down at the abyss with satisfaction. "This is my deadliest challenge," she said. "No weapons, no rules, just you, and whatever waits below." The guards shoved him forward. And Kellen fell. The endless drop. The world became a blur of rushing air and darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sensation of falling, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Then, impact. He crashed onto a stone platform, the breath torn from his lungs. He rolled onto his back, gasping. All around him, the abyss stretched into infinity. The air was heavy, thick with something, alive. Then he heard it. A slow, inhuman breath, the scraping of claws against stone. He was not alone. The horror in the dark. Kellen forced himself to his feet, his vision adjusting to the dim glow of strange, pulsing veins along the cavern walls. Then he saw it, a shape huge and twisted, slithering out of the shadows. Not a beast, not a creature of muscle and bone. A living nightmare. Its body was shifting, reforming, never the same shape twice. It had no eyes, yet Kellen could feel it watching him. It moved like liquid shadow, yet when its claws struck the ground, they tore deep grooves into the stone. It was a predator that fed on fear, and Kellen had just been dropped into its lair. The queen watches. Above, the queen sat back on her throne, watching through a holographic projection. Her generals, gathered around her, looked uneasy. One of them, a battle-worn commander with a scared face, leaned in. "My queen, even your best warriors never lasted more than 5 minutes in the pit." The queen's smirk didn't waver. "Then let's see how long he lasts." The dance of death. Kellen dodged as the creature struck, its clawed limb slamming into the stone where he had stood a second ago. The ground shattered. Dust exploded around him. He rolled, barely escaping. But the creature was fast, faster than anything he had faced before. Another attack, another dodge by inches. But he was running out of space. No weapons, no way out, no hope. But Kellen wasn't thinking about escape. He wasn't thinking about fear. He was thinking about winning. And then, he understood. The monster's secret. As the creature lunged again, Kellen didn't move. He stood perfectly still. The warriors watching above gasped. Suicide. The monster's claws sliced through the air. And missed. The queen's smirk vanished. A mind stronger than fear. Kellen exhaled slowly. It couldn't see. It had no eyes. No nose. It wasn't hunting him through sight or sound. It was hunting his fear. His movement. His heartbeat. Kellen slowed his breathing. He calmed his mind. The monster froze, its shifting form twitching uncertainly. Kellen took a slow step, but only when it wasn't looking. He wasn't fighting it. He was outsmarting it. A warrior unlike any other. The queen's fingers tightened against her armrest. No one had ever figured it out. Yet Kellen had. She leaned forward, watching as the monster grew restless, confused. And then, Kellen made his move. He led the creature straight into a stone wall, tricking it into thinking he was running. The beast crashed through the rock, its form splitting apart. The cavern trembled as debris fell from the ceiling, sealing it behind the rubble. The queen's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "Fascinating," she murmured. The hologram flickered, and the last image of Kellen standing in the darkness remained. He had survived again. But this time, it wasn't just survival. He had beaten the black pit. And for the first time, the queen wasn't just intrigued. She was afraid. The turning point. The gates of the black pit groaned as they unlocked, sending echoes through the cavern. The stone doors, untouched for years, split open with a deafening roar, spilling light into the abyss. Dust swirled in the golden glow, revealing a lone figure emerging from the depths. Kellen. His body was bruised, his breath ragged, but his gaze was sharper than ever. He had survived where no one else had, outsmarting a beast that had devoured countless warriors before him. His return was not just unexpected, it was impossible. The savage queen, seated high on her throne, did not move. But her fingers clenched slightly against the armrest. No one had ever walked out of the black pit before. No one had ever beaten it. And now, the warriors standing in the arena, those who had once seen Kellen as just another soldier, looked at him with new eyes, not as an equal, but as a threat, a challenge no one dared to make. The queen's eyes gleamed with a mix of fascination and danger. She had designed every trial to break men, to forge ruthless killers who obeyed without a question. But Kellen was not broken. He was something else entirely. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her fist. The warriors held their breath, waiting for her to speak. "You surprised me," she finally said, her voice smooth, unreadable. Kellen did not respond. He only stared back, unflinching. The queen tilted her head slightly. "You think yourself strong." Silence. Then she rose from her throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, predatory. Her armor, made from the bones of defeated warlords, gleamed under the firelight. The warriors stepped back. No one moved when the queen stepped forward. Because the last time she had entered the arena herself, an entire battalion of warriors had died at her feet. She unsheathed her sword, a curved obsidian blade that had never tasted defeat. "Prove it," she said. The crowd froze. Kellen's challenge had arrived. The duel that shouldn't have happened. Gasps rippled through the watching soldiers. No one had ever challenged the queen and lived. No one was allowed to challenge her. But this was different. She had issued the challenge herself. Kellen's hands curled into fists. He knew what this meant. This was not a fight to prove strength. This was a test to erase him. If he lost, he wouldn't just die. His name would be erased from history, as if he had never existed. He looked up at the queen, at the unreadable expression in her eyes. Why? Was it pride? Was it anger? Or was it fear? The arena holds its breath. The queen took a slow step forward, then another. Her every movement was controlled, like a predator stalking prey. Kellen took a steady breath. He wasn't a fool. The queen was not just a ruler. She was a warrior first. She had built this empire with her own hands, killing every challenger before him. If he fought the way her warriors did, relying on brute strength alone, he would die in seconds. So he wouldn't. He would do what he had done every time before. He would outthink her. The queen strikes first. She moved faster than he expected. A blur of black and silver, her sword sang through the air. Kellen barely dodged as the blade sliced through the space his head had just been. She wasn't testing him. She was going for the kill. Kellen rolled to the side, his mind racing. She was stronger. She was faster. But every warrior had a weakness. He had to find hers, and fast. The weakness of a queen. Kellen studied her movements, watching for patterns. Every warrior had a rhythm, a habit they didn't realize. Then he saw it. Every time she swung her blade, she always shifted her weight onto her left foot first. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And small mistakes were enough to kill. The queen lunged again, faster than lightning. Kellen didn't dodge. He stepped in. Her eyes flickered with surprise. Too late. He twisted his body, letting her blade slice past him. His foot slammed against her left leg. It was a minor shift, but enough. The queen stumbled. A single breath of hesitation. For the first time in years, she had been forced off balance. The moment everything changed, the arena fell silent. No one had ever made the queen stumble. Not once in her reign. She quickly recovered, her grip tightening on her blade. But in that fraction of a second, everyone had seen it. The warriors watching shifted. The air changed. The queen's rule was built on absolute power, absolute control. And Kellen had done something no warrior had ever done before. He had made the unshakable queen falter. She knew it. He knew it. And worst of all, her warriors knew it. The unspoken fear. The queen exhaled slowly. Her smirk returned, but there was something different behind it now. Kellen lowered his hands, stepping back. He had proven what he needed to. This fight was already over. Not because of strength, but because for the first time, doubt had entered the Queen's empire. And doubt was the beginning of rebellion. The duel that shook the empire. The air in the Colosseum of the Conqueror was thick with silence. For the first time in her reign, the savage queen had stumbled. It had lasted less than a second. A moment so small, so brief, that it should have meant nothing. But it meant everything. The warriors standing around the arena had seen it. The queen's power was built on the idea that she was unstoppable, unshakable. And now, Kellen had shattered that illusion. He had not overpowered her. He had outmaneuvered her. And that was far more dangerous. The queen's rage. The queen's fingers tightened around the hilt of her obsidian blade. Her heartbeat was steady, but something dark and unfamiliar coiled in her chest. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something worse. Doubt. She had killed kings, crushed empires beneath her heel. She had forged an army that answered to her and her alone. Yet now one warrior had made her falter. Her warriors were watching. She could feel their hesitation, and hesitation was the first step to rebellion, a battle that became a war. A slow smirk curled her lips. "Impressive," she murmured. Then she moved, faster than lightning. Kellen barely had time to react before her blade whipped through the air, a blur of death. He dodged, the cold whisper of steel slicing past his ribs. Too close. Another strike. Another. She was relentless now. Faster. Sharper. More dangerous. She wasn't just fighting to win. She was fighting to erase him. Kellen blocked, countered, evaded, but every time he gained ground, the queen pushed harder. And then, she vanished. Kellen's eyes widened. What? A sharp kick slammed into his ribs, sending him crashing to the ground. The warriors roared. The queen stood over him, her blade pointed at his throat. Her breathing was steady, her stance unshaken. For a moment, the empire belonged to her again. For a moment, her power was absolute. And then, Kellen laughed. A challenger's smile. The queen's eyes narrowed. Kellen wiped blood from his mouth, still smiling. Not out of arrogance, not out of defiance, but because he had already won. The queen realized it too late. The silence in the crowd was different now. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It was something far more dangerous. Expectation. For the first time in history, a warrior had stood against the queen and survived. For the first time, they had seen her struggle. And now, they wanted more. A kingdom begins to crumble. The queen's grip on her blade tightened. She could kill Kellen now. But it wouldn't matter. The damage had been done. The warriors had seen a man stand against her, not because he was stronger, but because he was different. And they would remember. The queen exhaled slowly. Then, to the shock of everyone in the arena, she lowered her blade. "Take him," she said. The guards hesitated. Her voice hardened. "Take him." The spell broke. The guards rushed forward, dragging Kellen to his knees. Shackles snapped around his wrists. But Kellen didn't resist, because he knew. Even in chains, he had already won. A silent defeat. The queen turned away, her steps slow, measured. Her mind was already racing. Kellen had changed something tonight. Her army would not rebel now. Not tomorrow. But the seed had been planted. And an empire built on fear could not survive doubt. She knew what she had to do. If Kellen was not broken, she would make him wish he was. The warriors' rebellion. The dungeons beneath the savage queen's fortress were carved from the bones of forgotten wars. They were built not to hold prisoners, but to erase them. Deep underground, where the screams of the condemned never reached the sky, Kellen sat in chains. His wrists burned from the metal cuffs, his body still aching from the duel. But his mind was sharper than ever. He had survived. And that meant everything. A prison that couldn't hold him. Outside his cell, the Queen's elite shadow guards stood watch, unmoving, silent. Their loyalty was absolute, or at least it had been. Kellen had seen the shift in their eyes after the duel. A hesitation, a flicker of something dangerous. Not fear, doubt. And doubt, Kellen knew, was the first crack in any empire. The Queen's growing fear. Above, in the great hall, the Queen paced like a caged beast. The torches cast sharp shadows across the war maps spread before her. Her advisors stood around her, but none dared to speak first, because they had seen it too. The duel had changed everything. One of her generals, a battle-scarred warrior named Commander Vorn, cleared his throat. "My queen," he said carefully, "the warriors are restless." She did not look at him. "Why?" Vorn hesitated. Then finally, he said the words she already knew. "They saw him stand against you. They saw him survive." The Queen's hands clenched into fists. She had built her empire on absolute strength, absolute fear. And now, one man had made them believe in something else. Hope. The unbreakable warrior. In the dungeons, Kellen was not alone. Other warriors had been thrown into cells after questioning orders. Men who, just days ago, had fought in the Queen's name without hesitation. Now, they sat in chains, watching him, studying him, and waiting. Finally, one of them spoke. "You fought her," the warrior murmured. His voice was rough, uncertain. "And you lived." Kellen lifted his gaze. He saw what the man really meant. If he could stand against her, maybe they could too. Kellen didn't smile. It wasn't time for that yet. Instead, he leaned forward and whispered, "Then let's stop waiting." The fall of a throne. The riot began at dawn. The first attack came from within the Queen's own ranks, a single guard who had seen too much, who had felt the shift in the air. One moment, the fortress was still. The next, a dagger was in a captain's throat. The alarm screamed through the halls as warriors who had once fought together turned on each other. The Queen did not move. She simply stood at the window of her war room, watching as her empire began to fracture. She had always known it would come to this. She just never expected it to happen so soon. The Queen's last move. As the rebellion spread through the fortress, the Queen gave a single command: "Bring Kellen to me." She would end this war before it even began. She would kill the rebellion at its heart, because there was one thing the Queen still believed. No empire, no army, no cause could survive without its leader. And so, as the fires of rebellion burned outside, Kellen was dragged from his cell, bloodied but unbroken. And the Queen, for the first time in her life, waited for a duel that would decide the fate of an empire. The rise of a new era. The throne room was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with peace, but the silence before a storm. Torches flickered, casting long, jagged shadows along the towering obsidian pillars. The walls were carved with the history of conquest, battle scenes depicting the savage Queen's rise to power, how she had crushed kings, burned cities, and built an empire that feared her name. But tonight, fear was not enough, because standing in the center of the throne room, shackles broken, eyes burning with defiance, was Kellen. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a challenger. And the Queen, for the first time in her reign, was alone. A duel that would decide everything. The fortress outside was in chaos. The rebellion had spread like wildfire, warriors turning against their former commanders, the Queen's elite guards fighting desperately to hold the gates. But none of it mattered anymore. This battle, the one between Kellen and the Queen, was the only one that truly mattered, because whoever walked away from this room would decide the fate of the empire. The Queen rose from her throne slowly, deliberately, her blade gleaming in the dim light. She looked at Kellen, not with anger, not with hatred, but with recognition. "You should have died in the black pit," she said softly. Kellen's jaw clenched. "You should have never ruled." The Queen smirked. Then take my throne, warrior, if you can. The last battle. She moved first. A blur of speed, steel slicing through the air. She was faster than before, deadlier, more precise. Kellen barely dodged, her blade grazing his cheek. The fight had begun. She struck again, a downward slash meant to split him in half. Kellen countered, twisting to the side, grabbing the hilt of a fallen sword from the ground. Clang. Steel met steel. Sparks flew. Kellen gritted his teeth. She was strong, stronger than any opponent he had ever faced. But strength wasn't what would decide this fight. Not anymore. A queen's greatest weakness. Kellen studied her movements. Her power was undeniable, but it was built on control. The problem with control. The moment it's lost, it's impossible to get back. Kellen faked a stumble. The queen saw weakness and lunged forward, blade flashing. But that's exactly what he wanted. At the last second, he shifted, letting her own momentum work against her. The queen's eyes widened. She realized too late. She had overcommitted. Kellen dodged cleanly, spun behind her, and crack. His boot slammed into the back of her leg. She staggered. Her grip on her sword faltered. The throne room gasped. For the second time in her rule, the queen had stumbled. And this time, she knew. She would not recover. The end of a reign. She fell to one knee, breathing hard. The tip of Kellen's sword pressed against her throat. Silence. Then, footsteps. The doors of the throne room burst open as warriors flooded in, not the queen's guards, but Kellen's rebels. The battle outside had already been decided. The queen's empire was no longer hers. Kellen stared down at her, his blade steady. The choice was his, to kill her, or to do something far worse. He took a slow breath, then, to the shock of everyone, he lowered his sword. "I'm not you," he said quietly. The queen laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Then, to everyone's shock, she smirked. She wiped the blood from her lip, looking up at Kellen. "Perhaps that is why you won." She knelt before him. A queen who had never bowed to anyone, bowing for the first time. A murmur rippled through the room. And then, the warriors knelt, too, one by one, until the entire army knelt before Kellen. A new era begins. The rebellion was over. The queen's reign had ended. But Kellen did not take the throne. Instead, he turned to the warriors, to the people, and made a choice no conqueror had ever made before. "No more rulers," he said. "No more queens, no more kings. We fight for each other now. We build an empire that doesn't serve one, but serves all." And so, under the blood-red sky of Sci-Fi, an empire built on fear fell. And from its ashes, a new world began. But in the shadows, far beyond the burning fortress, in the cold depths of the galaxy, someone watched. A lone figure, draped in darkness, observed the rebellion's victory. Their eyes gleamed, full of calculated amusement. "This," they murmured, "is only the beginning." And as Kellen stepped into the light of a new future, a greater war loomed on the horizon.